Hello, my name is Ryan McBride and welcome to Critical Thinking for the rest of us. Today's lecture, Cultivating Courage and Humility. We made it, folks. We made it to the final two intellectual virtues for this series. This week, we're going to go over courage and humility, and our lecture agenda is going to follow the same pattern that we saw last week. So to begin, I'm going to briefly review the intellectual virtues. Then I'm going to speak at length about courage as an intellectual virtue. Then I'm going to speak at length about humility as an intellectual virtue. Then we'll end with ways that we can develop courage and humility in our lives today. Then, of course, as always, you can expect some reflection questions to round things out. So let's get started. So the main thing that I want everyone to keep in mind with respect to intellectual virtues is that they are kinds of character traits that we can only develop by habituating our critical thinking skills. So importantly, the intellectual virtues are things that we must foster and develop through intentional practice. We can't simply listen to a podcast, watch a TV show, read a book, or what have you, and then suddenly have these virtues. They come simply through hard work. And if you recall, this concept of habituating the virtues links us up with Aristotle's thought, specifically in the Nicomachean Ethics. So I won't go too much into depth into that again, since I did that in the last lecture. But the core thing that I want everyone to keep in mind is that we must actively engage in the intellectual virtues in order for them to show up in our own characters. With that, we can jump right into courage as an intellectual virtue. So for our purposes, we're going to define courage as the readiness to confront challenges, question established beliefs, and engage with controversial topics, even when such engagement may provoke discomfort or backlash. Notice this definition doesn't really vary from our general conception of courage. So when we generally think about courage, we think about acting in the face of fear, or acting in spite of our fear. It's worth noting at this point that fear, as an emotion, actually plays a vital role in our capacity to act courageously when we think about courage generally. And this is something that Aristotle recognized thousands of years ago, is that in order to lead an ethical life, the emotions have to play a role in that life, or they do play a role in that life. And I just wanted to point that out because I think it's very interesting. But for our purposes, again, we're defining courage as the readiness to confront challenges, question established beliefs, and engage with controversial topics, even when such engagement may provoke discomfort or backlash. So next, we can ask, why is courage important? First, courage leads us to explore those areas of thought that we've been too afraid to explore up to this point. So I'm sure for many of you, there's tons of things that you would love to learn about that you've just simply been too afraid to tackle. And the example that I could come up with, at least here in the US, it's very common for many children to hear that, mathematics is hard and that you're not good at mathematics, or you don't have the mind for it, or it's a left brain kind of thinking and you're not adapted to it. Really, honestly, just toxic messages that suppress our desire to learn and induce fear in us. So if you're a person that has been attracted to mathematics in the past, but have been conditioned to not pursue it because you think that you're not smart enough or you don't have the right mind for it, courage allows you to jump into that fear and face that fear. So as a personal anecdote, I grew up as a very musical person, very artsy person, a very finger painting on the walls kind of guy, if you will. And, didn't excel at math and was told, of course, that I wouldn't be good at math anyway, or some message of the kind, right? And so when I got into college and school was no longer compulsory and I finally took an interest in it, I got the wily idea that I was going to become a medical doctor. Well, they told me, that's fine, but you're going to have to take a lot more math. And I nearly decided not to switch into the pre-med track because I was so afraid of math. But I had a conversation with my advisor, thank goodness, and it went really well. And I started taking my math classes. And, I did really well, actually. It took effort, it took work, but my drive and my intellectual curiosity and courage, allowed me to push through those barriers. And I studied as far as Calc 1, which is not very high. Nevertheless, I'm proud to say that I did get an A in that course. But that absolutely took an act of courage, because mathematics was not my forte. And I would argue still, quantitative reasoning, generally speaking, is not something that comes easy for me at all. And yet, despite that fact, by being courageous, when we're faced with these kinds of challenges, we can make progress. So courage is also important because it allows you to pursue your interests while circumventing doubt. It's okay to have that doubt. In fact, the doubt is what drives us. But by being courageous, we're allowed to put doubt where it belongs. We're able to compartmentalize it, circumvent it, and still pursue our goals. Next, courage allows us to face pushback more easily. So when we think about courage generally, there's that component of fear. And often it's bodily fear of some kind. It's a physical fear. So we often think of courage as manifesting as something like a soldier acting in the face of adversity, right? And there's this sense of bodily harm. Well, there is sometimes, but there's not often a sense of bodily harm that comes with the intellectual virtue of being courageous, right? So what is the equivalent? Well, the equivalent, of course, is pushback or blowback or resistance or confirmation bias that, oh, I'm not smart enough to be studying this. Or, in the form of, to go back to the pushback piece here is, hey, I think you're wrong about this, so I don't know why you're talking about it, right? Or whatever it might be, just pushback generally. This absolutely happens. But despite the fact that we will absolutely hit friction in our intellectual pursuits, courage allows us to press forward. Next, intellectual courage also encourages us to acknowledge when we've made a mistake in our reasoning. Because we've habituated ourselves to facing our fears, to circumventing our doubt, we're also able to recognize when we've reached certain limits within our reasoning and why. This piece requires another intellectual virtue, humility, so I won't go too much into depth about why this part is important, or why intellectual courage is important in this way. But nevertheless, do note that there's courage involved in acknowledging our mistakes. And then finally, I just want to say that courage absolutely increases our self-confidence and our dependability. So the more we practice being courageous and the more we face our fears, the more we face backlash, the more we face and acknowledge our mistakes, the more self-confident we become. This is the good thing. When you practice things, those things become easier. It just seems to be a fact about the way the world works, and it's great. And what's great about becoming a more self-confident version of yourself is that you inevitably become a more dependable person. So your family members, your friends, your colleagues, they can all look up to you because they recognize that, yes, you might have some certain fears, but you will nevertheless push forward. And I think that's a really beautiful thing. So how can we cultivate courage? First, engage in constructive debates. So if you really want to put these things to the test, these intellectual virtues, go have one of those tough intellectual conversations where you debate a topic, hopefully in the form of dialogue and not too deep into debating. But yes, have that conversation with a friend, someone you have a shared interest with, but you have varying points of view. And have the discussion of what you think and why. Hear this person out. What do they think and why? Compare your reasoning. See where you could strengthen your reasoning, where your friend could strengthen their reasoning, and so on and so forth. Of course, like all good things, when you're practicing them, the best thing to do is not to start with your end goal. So for instance, if you want to have a constructive conversation about politics with a friend who's very learned, and you still have progress to make in this area, your best bet might not be to jump right into that conversation. You might start with a smaller conversation, especially if you really struggle with intellectual courage, or I guess I should say if you really struggle with fear, or you're afraid of being told you're mistaken, and so on. So you might start with something small, and this is going to sound absolutely silly, but it nevertheless is a helpful way to go about it. So have that conversation about whether or not, for example, pineapple should be on pizza or not. This is a silly example, but by practicing having a dialogue, a debate about whether pineapple belongs on pizza, it makes the next time you have a tougher conversation that much easier. So it's all about incremental growth here. As an analogy, when you're strength training, you don't jump right into the heaviest weights. You start with the smaller weights and you build up incrementally each week until you reach your fitness goals. It's the same thing with the intellectual virtues. You have to train them by starting small, and that is okay. Next, we can view criticism as an opportunity for growth. So I won't speak too much about this because this links us up to humility. Just recognize that the more we practice courage, the more we habituate facing our intellectual fears, facing pushback. So much so that we will, with time, become more and more comfortable with fear, with pushback. By pulling these things into our consciousness and actively focusing on them, we can better see when criticism is well-founded. And this is wonderful because it's through criticism, it's through hardship generally, that we are able to improve as individuals. So criticism is absolutely an opportunity for growth. Next, it's really difficult to develop intellectual courage if we surround ourselves in an intellectual environment that is constantly reaffirming our beliefs. So if you find yourself surrounded by people, by social media, by news, by information in general that simply confirms what you already believe, you're not providing yourself with the kind of soil you need to develop these intellectual virtues. You have to seek diverse perspectives. You have to go beyond what you already know and believe in order to stretch your mind to new limits. So, as a general watchword or as a general watch phrase, always seek diverse perspectives. To do so does not mean that you're going to agree with these perspectives. Not at all. However, you might learn something in the process. No, I will be so bold as to say you will absolutely learn something in the process. It's all about testing our hypotheses. Finally, this might be kind of strange to hear in a philosophy podcast, but practicing mindful reflection absolutely develops our courage, and I'll tell you why. Mindful reflection can be divided in two kinds of acts, or at least there's two kinds of acts I would like to focus on for our purposes. There is absolutely the act of active self-reflection, where we maybe sit down with our journal. I always encourage people to journal. We sit down with our journal and rewrite out, well, what do I believe here? Why do I believe this? Or why was I mistaken about this belief that I held? Why did I get pushback in this instance, and how can I improve, right? Absolutely actively reflecting on our beliefs, particularly through the written word, is an extremely powerful tool in your arsenal. However, and I think this is the part that might surprise you, is I personally believe very strongly that meditation, so mindfulness, but specifically, a meditation practice of some kind, is vital to developing our intellectual virtues, because by focusing our mind on the present and sustaining that focusing activity, we provide the right kind of soil for critical self-reflection to develop in. And through critical self-reflection, we develop the intellectual virtues, because they all require critical self-reflection of some kind. So, ways to cultivate courage? Jump into some lively debates with your friends on intellectual topics that you share in common. They don't necessarily have to be intellectually driven, or obviously intellectually driven either. If you folks have a favorite movie that you like to watch, or a genre of music, whatever it might be, have a conversation about it with your friends. Build that community and practice those dialogue skills. Next, view criticism as an opportunity for growth, because it is. As always, seek diverse perspectives. I always encourage this. And finally, develop that meditation practice. Not only as a meditation practice proper, but also sitting down with yourself, pen and paper, and actively self-reflecting on your beliefs and why you hold those beliefs. Now let's move on to humility. For our purposes, we'll define humility as the recognition of the limitations of one's knowledge. It embodies the understanding that no individual possesses complete mastery over every or any subject, that there is always room for learning and growth. So I'm going to be a bit pedantic here, and I'm going to repeat myself because that last sentence I think is very important. And when we really grasp what this sentence means, I think it in itself is quite humbling. So humility embodies the understanding that no individual possesses complete mastery over every or any subject, that there is always room for learning and growth. That means that even if you're an expert in your field, there's still room for growth. You still don't know things. And just to focus this again on knowledge and the intellect specifically, and we're going to speak about this at length because I personally find it very interesting, is that to know something, whatever it is to not know something else. For example, I studied philosophy. I've devoted over 10 years to pursuing this domain of inquiry, if you will, at the expense of learning, for example, physics or chemistry or ice skating or flower arrangement, whatever it might be, right? So just in virtue of being a human, when we come to know something, it's at the expense of literally everything else in the world. That's wild. What that translates to, for our purposes, is that to know something is necessarily to be ignorant of everything else. I think that's very humiliating because ignorance suddenly becomes a sort of mandatory condition for us to know anything at all. That's wild. So something that we all share in common, just in virtue of being human, is ignorance. But let's move on. So why is humility important? First, humility allows you to find the limitations of your knowledge. If we are not humble, we cannot find the limitations of the things that we know, or it becomes much harder to recognize those limitations. And as I just said, everyone, no matter how intelligent they are, everyone has their intellectual limits. Humility permits us to face those limitations and acknowledge them for what they are. Next, as a consequence of this first piece, humility allows us to focus on those areas of less competency. As with all areas of personal growth, you cannot make progress if you don't first recognize what it is you need to make progress in. So, as an analogy, if I'm fumbling around in the dark and I keep bumping my head on something, there's no way that I can make progress without turning the lights on and acknowledging what it is that I'm butting my head up against. I have to do this process of facing whatever it is I'm afraid to face, whatever it is I've left in the dark. This is true across the board, but also in pursuit of knowledge. I can't move forward in my knowledge if I don't know where I fall short. So I recognize my limitations, and then I focus on those areas where I'm less competent and have room for growth. Next, humility absolutely allows us to better empathize with others. So remember, as I just said, if we're having a conversation with somebody and we don't necessarily agree with them, this is going to happen. It's already probably happened in your life and it will continue to happen. What we know at a fundamental level is that despite the fact that we don't agree on some topic, just in virtue of the human condition, we share a vital characteristic in common, and that is the fact of our shared ignorance. There are absolutely things that both of us don't know about. There's things about the world that we're both going to forget or we have forgotten, right? So recognizing the conditions in which we all live via humility allows us to better empathize with the people that we're conversing with, living with, so on and so forth. So just as humility allows us to acknowledge our limitations in our knowledge, it also allows us to acknowledge just total gaps in what we know. This is a really good thing, and I'll tell you why. I'm all about the can-do, self-reliant attitude. I've always been a big fan of the transcendentalists and Ralph Waldo Emerson and self-reliance and all this. But nevertheless, it's okay and even pragmatic to acknowledge that we don't know everything. And I'll tell you why. Here's with a silly example. So I recently moved to a new apartment, and I've spent a lot of time trying to decorate it in a way that I find, beautiful and just surrounds me with happiness. I just want to live in a good environment that, reflects my personality and so on and so forth. And I've devoted a lot of time into, finding pieces of furniture and artwork and things that, speak to my soul. But nevertheless, I'm still a little dissatisfied. One reason that I'm dissatisfied could simply be the fact that I don't know anything about interior design, or I know very little about it. And because I know little about it, I'm not going to be able to make the progress that I think I'm supposed to make or the progress that I want to make. But by acknowledging that gap, hey, I don't know this, I can now take that next step, which is seeking help or researching interior design in the ways that I need in order to meet my goals. So it's absolutely pragmatic to simply acknowledge, hey, I don't know something here, and that's okay, because I'm willing to learn, or I know how to go about acquiring what it is I need to know. Finally, intellectual humility increases productivity when it comes to conversing with others that may or may not share opposing views to our own, because it disarms our defensiveness. We already know, or we've made an active effort in recognizing our limits. We've acknowledged our knowledge gaps. And so when we're faced with those knowledge gaps and those limitations in conversation, we're not going to be surprised. And we're not going to be as defensive because we already know these limitations. We already know these gaps. So we can compartmentalize those uncomfortable feelings in pursuit of the goal, which is to learn something in the dialogue that we're having in the present. Good. So how can we begin to cultivate humility? First, we can actively admit our knowledge gaps. We can do this by sitting down. Again, as I said, I always encourage personal journaling, keeping a personal diary of some kind. Sit down and actively reflect on those areas of the world that we don't know about or we take an interest in. And then, of course, ask yourself, well, why do I not know this? What's the hang up here? Conversely, if you want to push yourself a little harder, you can write out all the things you know or all the things you think you know. And then under that list, for each item, list the things you don't actually know in that domain. To give you an example, and it's kind of a silly one, but it's what I know. I know a lot about philosophy. I'm being extremely general here because by saying I know philosophy, I'm not actually saying much of anything, but for the sake of argument, I know a lot about philosophy. But what do I not know about philosophy? Well, I can tell you personally that I'm not very gifted at political philosophy, political social philosophy. This is a weaker area for me. I don't find, I'm not particularly interested in it, so it takes me a little bit more work to jump into it. And yeah, I hit a little bit more resistance when diving into the more particular, the more practical, the more down to earth. I'm very much more of a mind in the clouds kind of. I'm interested, in epistemology and metaphysics and consciousness, these very big, broad topics that, when it comes to applying them to the situation that I find myself in today, well, that act of situating is kind of difficult for me. And that's just the kind of person that I am. But nevertheless, in doing this activity of sitting down and writing out, well, what do I not know about my discipline and why? Well, I'm acknowledging limits, I'm acknowledging gaps, and I'm acknowledging hang-ups, I'm acknowledging biases, I'm acknowledging all kinds of things. And in doing that, I'm absolutely going to be developing my intellectual humility. Next, seek feedback. Now, you don't want to seek feedback from everybody because not everybody has your best interest in mind. But seek feedback from your loved ones. Seek feedback from your friends. It could be your son, your daughter, your spouse, your partner, an old teacher, a good friend, an uncle, whoever it might be. Seek feedback on areas in which you may be falling short in whatever capacity. And so what's driving this thought, and why am I offering this to you? I'm very much, within the school of existentialism. This is where I personally thrive. And something that I've carried from that and deeply believe is that even though I'm the main character in this drama, my life, even though I have a first-person perspective on the world and on myself. That does not make me the expert on who I am as a person. It does not make me an expert on myself, because our self has a social side. It's socially facing as well, and it's socially constructed. And I don't mean that in an artificial sense, but in a very deep metaphysical sense. Part of who I am as a person belongs to the social sphere. It's dictated or created by my engagement as a social animal. Meaning, if I really want to understand who I am, I have to reach out to my community. I have to engage in my community. I have to engage in the situation that I find myself in, because it's the other that knows about me in a particular way that I don't, just as I know myself in a particular way that the other won't necessarily be able to appreciate or dig into from their third-person perspective of me. And so seeking feedback is critical when it comes to developing humility and even courage, because it fills out our understanding of ourselves. We might have certain knowledge gaps or biases or limitations or act rashly in a certain way or what have you, and never recognize it simply because we don't have the right kind of vantage point that, our mother or father or friend has. So seeking feedback is a very powerful tool and a very powerful act that we can commit in our pursuit of these intellectual virtues. Next, we can reflect on past errors in order to develop humility. Now, this is probably the most direct and on-the-nose way of doing so I want to give you some practical advice here, or offer you a practical way of going about reflecting on your errors. And that way is what I call the 5 whys. It's also known as a retro. This isn't my idea at all. I got it from a friend, so I'm sure it's floating out there somewhere. I don't know whose idea it was originally, but nevertheless, I'll call it the 5 whys. So if there's an error that we've made in our life, say, I upset my son, or I got chided by a boss at work, whatever it might be, write that out as it happened. Today I was reprimanded by my boss. And then you ask yourself, why was I reprimanded? And then you answer that question. And you answer it in a declarative sentence. So I was reprimanded by my boss because I showed up to work late. Whatever it is. And then you ask yourself, next layer, why was I late for work? So you keep going back in your reasoning by asking the question why. And what inevitably happens is you end up in a dark place in your soul. Now, I don't mean a dark place as in a bad place, but in a dark place of your soul that you haven't explored a lot. What inevitably happens is you dig deep into yourself and you start to get into your core beliefs and core motivations, core reasons why you act the way you act. So I would encourage you to bring a flashlight if you do this activity, because you will absolutely be doing a little soul searching here, or soul exploration is a better term for it. But nevertheless, the 5 whys, a very powerful practice, a very powerful tool that you can implement in developing humility and just becoming a better version of yourself in general. Now, I want to provide you an example of the 5 whys just to bring this more into the practical realm and make this whole experience a little bit more human. So in the past, I won't go into too much details because it is humiliating, but I was let go from a job. And by and large, me getting fired was outside of my control. I think the reasons why I was fired were poor ones, as a matter of fact, and that's okay. But nevertheless, I had no control over the fact that I was being let go. It's just something that was going to happen despite my protests. And I did protest, or I gave reasons why I shouldn't be let go. And yeah, it's not in my control, and I was let go. And so in that moment, at that time, I had a handful of ways at my disposal in which I could react. The most obvious one, and one that many of us would latch onto, is by simply saying, hey, this person's dumb, or the reason I'm getting fired is ridiculous and this company sucks, and just, being really upset and just totally passing the buck here. Another reaction that I could take, and it's the one that I took, is to simply ask myself, okay, well, getting fired, by and large, not in my power in the specific circumstances under which I was fired. Nevertheless, there was something within my control, right? So I'm very much, as much as I am an existentialist, I love Stoicism. And I love Stoicism because it's all about carving out that space between what's within my control and what's not within my control. What's within my control is my judgments and my reactions to things. And basically, literally everything else is outside of my control. And so, being a good Stoic in this moment, I asked myself, well, what was in my control? Why was I fired? How can I improve here so it doesn't happen again? And my friend, a good friend of mine, said, well, why don't we do a retro, the 5 whys? And so we sat down and we did it. And as I said, I inevitably ended up in a very, unexplored core part of my soul where I was facing my, core values, my core beliefs, and honestly, core mistakes about the way I was navigating my world. It was very scary, very humiliating, but also extremely rejuvenating because now, in virtue of having done that exercise, I understood where I could make progress. So I just wanted to offer that to, give you a practical example of how you might go about doing this. Of course, note that I did do this with a friend. So, you can absolutely do the 5 whys in a personal journal or what have you. But if you have a trusted friend, partner, or somebody that you whose opinion of you or understanding of you value, they can also be a really great resource, a reflecting sounding board for this activity. And finally, for ways to cultivate humility, again, appreciating those diverse perspectives. We cannot grow if we don't challenge ourselves. We cannot grow if we surround ourselves with the things that simply confirm our biases. So we have to push ourselves. We have to go beyond what we're comfortable with in order to grow in the ways that we are hoping to grow. All right, so we're approaching the end here. We've spoken a little bit about how to cultivate courage. We've spoken a little bit about how to cultivate humility. Let's talk about how we can cultivate them in our lives today. Now, there's many ways that you can go about doing this, and I just want to offer you a few practical means so that you can get going with the process if you so choose. And the first one would be jump into some self-reflection sessions. Do that, again, in your journal. Do it with a loved one. Do it with a friend. However you want to go about this, start actively reflecting on your beliefs. Really take an active approach to analyzing what you believe and desire. Doing this is so illuminating. Connected to that, you might consider developing a meditation practice with the specific goal, again, I'll repeat, to strengthen your present awareness. Active present awareness is something that requires habituation. It's very hard. Our attention spans are not as long as we like to think they are, especially in this day and age when we're surrounded by so much stimulus. So developing a meditation practice, always a good thing. And it will absolutely furnish the soil in which these intellectual virtues, all of them, will be able to grow. Next, list out those things that you've always wanted to learn about but haven't had the courage to pursue. If it's mathematics, physics, violin, it doesn't matter what it is, poetry, whatever it is, list out those things. I really wish I knew about this, or I really wish I had practiced doing this, right? So I have a friend, I'm thinking specifically, it just came into my mind. She's always, she grew up playing piano, but no longer has a piano and has tossed around the idea of getting another piano. Hasn't yet done it, mainly because she's very busy. But nevertheless, I suspect that there's a little bit of fear involved in that as well. But importantly, again, we have to acknowledge our limitations. We have to acknowledge the roadblocks here. So just beginning by listing out, well, what is it that I want to learn? That's a very powerful first step. And then you can begin to identify smaller steps you can take from there, right? So maybe my friend isn't in a place yet. She doesn't have the strength to just go out and buy a piano. That's okay. She can start by going through piano catalogs with no expectations beyond that. She just look at them. So incremental steps, incremental growth. And then finally, list out things that you actually don't want to learn about. I know this might seem crazy, but if you want to develop your humility, if you want to develop your courage even, and engage in those diverse perspectives, you have to know what it is you're adverse to. So list these things out. And then yes, next step, start exploring some of them. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I promise you, it's very illuminating. So to give you a personal example, again, political social philosophy, not my strong suit. History in general, not my strong suit. I also don't have a very big interest in it, not by and large. To curb that, I've started reading more history texts or social economic texts, things that are, geared in this direction, just to bring, to challenge those adversities that I recognize in myself. And so, part of this is a matter of circumstance. There's a recent new translation that came out of Marx's Capital, the first volume. And so I'm reading that, and I have no experience in economics, and I can tell you it's been a wild ride. It's been very illuminating. So those are some practical ways that we can begin to develop courage and humility today. So as always, I want to end with a few reflection questions for you that you can take and ponder at will. So first question, would you define yourself as someone who is intellectually courageous? If so, what did you do to develop that virtue? If not, what is holding you back? Second question, do you think that intellectual humility means that you cannot assert your expertise in a given area? If so, why? If not, how do you balance confidence with humility in this instance? And then finally, in what ways can you cultivate courage and humility in your day-to-day life? So this week we covered a lot. We briefly reviewed the intellectual virtues. Then we took an in-depth dive into courage as an intellectual virtue. We did the same with humility as an intellectual virtue. And then we talked about practical ways of developing courage and humility. So now we're going to be shifting gears moving forward. We're leaving behind the intellectual virtues. We've talked about them in depth. So we've talked about charity, we've talked about skepticism, courage, humility, curiosity, and so on. Next, we're going to be diving into the origins of critical thinking as a discipline by analyzing the Socratic method, and I'm very excited. So stay tuned for the next lecture, The Socratic Method, a Timeless Thinking Tool. Thank you.